Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're always curious to know which corners of the world and what hours of night these forgotten accounts manage to reach. On the morning of August 23, 1848, a local merchant named Henry Dobson was making his way down the muddy trail that wound along the western banks of the Atchafalaya River, just outside the growing settlement of St. Martinville. The air hung heavy with humidity, the kind that makes the world seem slower, thicker, typical for late summer in Louisiana. What caught Dobson's attention, and what would later become the first recorded piece of evidence in what history now calls the Harlan plantation mystery, was an abandoned carriage, half sunk in the soft riverbank mud. The carriage's paint was chipped but bore a distinctive crest, an interlocked H and V, the insignia of the Harlan estate, one of the largest cotton plantations 5 miles east of town. Inside, Dobson found little but a few haunting details. A single lady's glove, a man's ledger book with its pages blank, and a silver locket that, strangely, contained no portrait or inscription. By noon that same day, Dobson reported his discovery to the St. Martin Parish Constable, a man named Robert Hensley. His records note that no member of the Harlan family had been seen in town for nearly 3 weeks. It wasn't unusual for plantation owners to remain secluded during harvest season. Yet Charles Harlan, age 46, was known for his punctuality. He visited the First Bank of Lafayette every Thursday without fail. According to bank records examined later, he had missed 3 such appointments with no word or explanation. Constable Hensley dispatched 2 deputies to investigate the Harlan plantation that afternoon. What they found would become the foundation of one of Louisiana's most disturbing and quietly buried mysteries. The main house appeared immaculate. The 26 enslaved people who worked the cotton fields continued their labor as though nothing were amiss. The house servants moved about calmly. Dinner had been prepared, beds made, the household kept in perfect order. It was as if the Harlan family were simply away for the day, but they were gone. Charles Harlan, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children, Nathaniel, 23, Clara, 20, and James, 18, were nowhere to be found. Only one person seemed out of place. A house slave named Clara Duval, about 30 years of age, who had once been Mrs. Harlan's personal maid. According to others on the property, she now spent hours sitting motionless in the parlor, silent and still, except when performing her duties. When questioned, not one enslaved worker reported anything unusual. Each of them gave the same reply, almost word for word. "Master Harlan has gone to visit his brother in Natchez. He'll be back before the harvest." But Charles Harlan had no brother in Natchez, or anywhere for that matter. Over the following weeks, the constable quietly opened a deeper inquiry. Neighbors were questioned. Plantation owners in surrounding parishes were consulted. Every one of them acknowledged that the Harlan family had been absent, but curiously, none expressed concern. Like the servants on the property, they all seemed to accept, without hesitation, that the family had simply gone away. When pressed for details, most became uneasy. Some changed the subject altogether. Parish records show that by September 1848, a more formal investigation was ordered by Judge Everett Langston, a respected local jurist and business associate of Charles Harlan. Langston noted in his private journal, discovered decades later, what he called the strange silence surrounding the Harlan affair. "It is not merely that the family has vanished," he wrote. "It is that no one wishes to speak of it, as though the entire community has made a pact to look away." By October, with the Harlans still missing, the plantation continued to operate as if nothing had changed. Cotton was harvested, processed, and sold. The profits were deposited into the Harlan account at the First Bank of Lafayette, authorized by signatures matching Charles Harlan's handwriting, though no one ever saw the man himself. It was around this time that rumors began to spread about Clara Duval's strange behavior. The once quiet housemaid was now said to have taken over the master bedroom. Other servants whispered that she had begun wearing Mrs. Harlan's clothing and jewelry, walking through the halls in fine dresses, giving orders in Margaret's exact voice and tone. No one dared to challenge her. Judge Langston recorded one particularly troubling interview with a field worker named Moses, who was caught attempting to flee the estate in early November. Before being returned, Moses reportedly told the judge, "There ain't no Harlans no more." Miss Clara says there never was. Moses was returned to the plantation that same night. He was never seen again. By December 1848, the Harlan estate had fallen into a bizarre rhythm. The plantation's business continued seamlessly as if guided by invisible hands. Visitors who came to deliver goods or collect payment were greeted not by an overseer, but by Clara Duval herself, dressed elegantly, poised and entirely in control. One merchant, a milliner from New Orleans, described the encounter later in a deposition. The colored woman received me in the front parlor, wearing Mrs. Harlan's own gown and jewels. She spoke perfect English, refined, graceful. When I asked to see Mrs. Harlan, she smiled and said, "You are speaking with her." Judge Langston, increasingly alarmed, tried to organize a formal investigation early the next year, but his efforts were quietly blocked. Officials insisted it was a private matter. Others warned him to stop asking questions. In one of his letters to his brother in New Orleans, Langston wrote, "Something has happened here that no one wishes to acknowledge. It is as if the parish has conspired to pretend the Harlans still exist, even when all evidence says otherwise." The most chilling evidence came in February 1849, when a daguerreotype was taken during a dinner at the Harlan plantation, attended by neighboring landowners. The photograph, later discovered in a private collection, shows a lavish meal, and at the head of the table sits Clara Duval, adorned in lace and pearls. None of the white guests appeared disturbed. A later analysis of the image revealed something extraordinary. Every guest is smiling, laughing, engaged, as though the presence of a black woman presiding as mistress of the house was completely ordinary. By March, Judge Langston's inquiries drew hostile attention. His home was vandalized. He received anonymous threats. By April, he was removed from his judicial post on grounds of emotional instability. When he left for New Orleans, he took with him his private notes on what he called the strangest and most shameful episode in Louisiana's history. The most detailed account of what may have happened to the Harlan family came years later, from an unexpected source. In 1865, after the end of the Civil War, a former slave named Isaiah Turner, who had once lived on the neighboring Beaumont plantation, gave testimony to a Union Army officer collecting reports from newly freed people in Louisiana. His statement, preserved for decades in military archives, describes what happened on the night of August 1st, 1848, 3 weeks before the abandoned Harlan carriage was found on the riverbank. According to Turner, the tension on the Harlan plantation had been building for years. "Master Harlan," he said, "had a kind of cruelty that didn't always show on the skin. It was the kind that breaks something inside you. And Clara," he said, "suffered more than most." Turner claimed that Clara Duval had been purchased by Charles Harlan in 1842. She'd come from a French family in New Orleans. Well-educated, fluent in both English and French, she was intended, according to the bill of sale, to serve as Mrs. Harlan's personal maid, but Charles's intentions were far from domestic. Over the years, he had subjected her to something that went beyond abuse, something methodical and consuming. Turner's words painted a picture not of a single night's madness, but of a slow unraveling that had taken 6 years to reach its end. "It didn't happen all at once," he told the officer. "It was like water dripping on stone. One day you look, and the stone's hollowed out." The night of August 1st began quietly. Clara had prepared a large dinner, Turner said, the kind served when the family wanted to celebrate something. The entire household was present, Charles, Margaret, their 3 children, and several guests expected to arrive later that evening. Turner described how the meal began as any other: roast duck, sweet potatoes, wine, but midway through, the atmosphere changed. They started choking, he said, grabbing at their throats. The young ones went first, then Mrs. Harlan, then him. Charles Harlan had locked eyes with Clara, realization dawning too late. She just sat there, Turner recalled, calm as still water, watching them die. Afterward, Clara gathered the house servants and told them exactly what to do. Turner remembered her words. "The Harlans have gone to visit family in Natchez. I'll be managing things until they return, no one argued. No one questioned her. It was like we all forgot what we'd seen, Turner said. Like we were under a spell. She directed several men to carry the bodies to the swampy eastern edge of the property, a stretch of ground nobody ever visited because of the snakes and the mud that swallowed your boots whole. They buried the family there, under cypress roots and thick moss, while Clara stood over them in silence. From that night on, the Harlans were never spoken of again. It was like they'd never been, Turner said. She wore the missus' dresses, slept in their bed. At first just around us. But then white folk started coming to dinner, and she'd greet them at the door like she'd always belonged there. Perhaps the most unsettling detail of Turner's account was not what Clara did, but how the white community reacted. They knew, he said. The neighbors, the merchants, they knew exactly who she was. But they acted like they didn't see it. They'd sit at her table, talk polite, laugh like everything was normal. It was easier that way. Turner's words suggested something deeper than fear, a shared refusal to acknowledge what had happened, as if the truth itself was more dangerous than the crime. Judge Langston, writing years earlier in one of his private journals, had come to a similar conclusion. They cannot admit what has occurred without admitting what made it possible, and that, it seems, they cannot bear. The historical record after 1850 becomes fragmented, but what little survives paints a picture of quiet continuity, as if nothing at all had changed. The Harlan plantation continued to operate. Cotton shipments went out on schedule. Profits flowed through the same bank. Documents from the period still bore Charles Harlan's signature, though handwriting experts later confirmed that the newer signatures were forgeries. Elegant, practiced, and likely written by Clara herself. Then, in 1853, a fire consumed much of the main house. The cause was listed as accidental. No deaths were recorded. Within a year, the house was rebuilt, smaller, humbler, but on the same foundation. And still, business carried on. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 scattered records and disrupted commerce, but tax ledgers show that the estate remained active, run by someone referred to as the Harlan representative. Then, in 1866, something remarkable occurred. The entire property, house, fields, and remaining slaves, now freed, was transferred to a Mrs. Clara White, described in legal documents as a free woman of color. The transaction was processed by the same bank that had once handled the Harlan accounts. After that, the name Clara Duval disappears from the record entirely. In the 1870 census, a woman called Clara White, aged 48, appears as the owner of a modest but prosperous farm on land that had once belonged to the Harlans. The record lists her as a widow, no children, literate, and property-owning, an anomaly for a black woman in post-war Louisiana. She lived quietly for the next decade. Locals knew her as Madam White. Parish archives from St. Joseph's Church list her among their donors, her name appearing beside those of white parishioners. Then, in 1882, she died. The parish burial log notes her age, cause of death, complications of age, and little else. But the story did not end with her death. In 1929, a folklorist named Margaret Dunar interviewed elderly residents of St. Martin Parish for an oral history project. One of them, a 93-year-old woman named Josephine Taylor, claimed to have been a child servant at the Beaumont plantation when the Harlan tragedy occurred. Taylor's memory confirmed nearly everything Turner had said, but added something chilling. It wasn't just fear that kept folks quiet, she said. Some of them, the white ladies, they admired her. They'd take tea with her, talk about dresses and servants like she was one of them. They knew what she'd done, but they looked at her and saw something else, something they wished they could be. Free. Dunar's notes describe Taylor's words in trembling script. They lived through her. She did what they couldn't. That's why they never told. That's why they called her Mrs. Harlan. By the time Dunar finished her research, nearly every physical trace of the Harlan plantation had vanished. The land had been subdivided, built over, paved. Nothing remained but stories, fragmented, whispered, half-believed, and yet, through those whispers, Clara Duval, once property, once murderer, once mistress, had become something more enduring than any of them. In 1936, Nearly a century after the events at the Harlan plantation, Edward Langston, grandson of Judge Everett Langston, received a request from the history department at Louisiana State University. They wanted permission to publish his grandfather's surviving notes on what they called the Harlan affair. Edward declined. In a letter preserved among his personal papers, he wrote, "Some stories once told cannot be untold. My grandfather was haunted not by what happened at the Harlan plantation, but by what it revealed about the people who lived around it." Some truths are too heavy for polite history. That same year, construction workers widening the old Spanish Trail, not far from the former Harlan property, unearthed 5 human skeletons buried deep in the swampy ground. Parish records note that the remains were ancient, likely from the last century, and that 2 appeared to be male, 1 female, and 2 indeterminate. No investigation followed. The bones were quietly reburied in an unmarked grave in Highland Cemetery, the same resting place where parish archives say Clara White was buried half a century earlier. By then, all trace of the plantation had disappeared beneath the expanding town of St. Martinville. Houses, shops, and later highways covered what had once been the Harlan estate. No historical markers were ever erected. No plaque honored the dead. Only a handful of yellowed pages in the Langston papers hinted that anything had ever happened there. The story might have faded completely if not for the discovery made 3 decades later. In 1966, renovations to the First Bank of Lafayette, the same bank that had managed the Harlan accounts, uncovered a hidden compartment behind a paneled wall in what used to be the manager's office. Inside lay a leather portfolio, sealed and intact despite the century of humidity. It contained bank ledgers from 1848 to 1853, with entries for the C. Harlan account. The handwriting changed mid-year, August 1848 to be exact. The early entries were written in the firm, confident hand of Charles Harlan. The later ones were smooth imitations, subtle, elegant, but wrong in proportion and rhythm. Graphologists confirmed that the earlier entries matched known examples of Harlan's handwriting from business contracts before his disappearance. The later ones, though skillful, belonged to another hand entirely. Those later records revealed a strange evolution. Before August 1848, most withdrawals were for plantation expenses, equipment, supplies, freight. After that date, the spending pattern shifted dramatically. Smaller regular cash withdrawals appeared, and new purchases were recorded: medical books, French literature, women's jewelry, and imported perfume. In 1850, the account listed payment to a private tutor from New Orleans, described as providing instruction at the estate twice weekly. That same year, it recorded the purchase of freedom papers for 3 individuals identified as property of neighboring estates. There was no note explaining why the Harlan account, ostensibly still managed under Charles's name, would be used to buy the freedom of other planters' slaves. The records continued until 1852, when a separate account was opened under the name Mrs. C. White, with an initial deposit transferred directly from the Harlan holdings. That transaction marked the beginning of Clara's legal transformation, from an enslaved woman who had vanished into rumor to a free landowner who appeared without explanation on official documents. Historians who reviewed these findings in the late 1960s argued that the ledgers proved more than a forgery. They demonstrated a systematic reconstruction of identity, carried out in plain sight. It was as if the entire community had agreed to let the illusion stand, rather than confront the impossible reality behind it. Dr. Marcus Freeman, a historian at Tulane University who studied the ledgers in 1953, called it the perfect paradox of the antebellum South. The system was built so rigidly on race, he wrote, that when reality defied those boundaries, the human mind simply refused to see it. The very structure that made the crime unimaginable also made it invisible. Supporting his argument were several surviving letters from local residents of that era. In one dated October 1849, Eliza Beaumont, wife of a neighboring plantation owner, wrote to her sister in Virginia, "There are strange goings-on at the Harlan estate. We find it more convenient to accept what is presented than to inquire too deeply into matters best left undisturbed." Even among the enslaved community, the silence held. Isaiah Turner, in his 1865 testimony, had said something that scholars would later call crucial to understanding the psychology of the affair. "We all knew," he said, "every one of us. But to speak it out loud would destroy it. And maybe some of us, we wanted to see how long they'd pretend not to see what was right before them." The daguerreotype, photograph discovered in 1931, remains perhaps the most disturbing artifact of the entire case. It showed a formal dinner at the Harlan estate, taken in February 1849, just 6 months after the family's disappearance. Seated at the head of the table was a woman of African descent in a silk gown, her expression calm, composed, unmistakably authoritative. Around her, white men and women dined, laughed, and raised their glasses. Not one looked uneasy. Modern analysis conducted in 1969 confirmed that the woman in the photograph was indeed of African heritage and matched descriptions of Clara Duval. Dr. Catherine Monroe, a psychologist who reviewed the image for her study Collective Reality and Southern Mythmaking, 1972, wrote, "The expressions on their faces do not betray horror or confusion. They show the serene attentiveness of people utterly unwilling to perceive what they see. It is a communal act of blindness, a shared agreement that this cannot be happening, therefore it is not." Dr. Monroe coined the phrase selective reality to describe the phenomenon. She argued that what occurred at the Harlan plantation was not a mass deception, but a collective psychological defense. To acknowledge what Clara had done, she wrote, would have required them to acknowledge what had been done to her. It was safer to pretend, to create a fiction so airtight that everyone, black and white alike, could survive within it. Other scholars suggested the fiction became self-sustaining, evolving into a kind of unspoken performance that lasted decades. Businessmen continued to trade with the plantation. Clerks processed its accounts. Clergy accepted its donations. Each act, however small, reinforced the illusion that nothing unthinkable had ever occurred. The silence, it seemed, had its own gravitational pull. To question it was to risk exile from the society that depended on it. By the time Reconstruction began, the fiction was complete. The Harlan name had quietly disappeared from local memory, replaced by that of Mrs. Clara White. Parish archives listed her as a benefactor, the landowner of a smaller but productive farm, and a woman of exceptional refinement. She had transformed from property into proprietress, not through revolution, but through the community's refusal to confront her crime. By the time the smoke of the Civil War had cleared and the chaos of Reconstruction began, the fiction that had cocooned the Harlan plantation had hardened into fact. No one spoke the Harlan name anymore. Parish registries, land deeds, and bank documents all listed the property under Mrs. Clara White, free woman of color. And what was once a grotesque secret became simply another entry in the bureaucratic ledgers of post-war Louisiana. In 1870, the U.S. Census Enumerator for St. Martin Parish recorded her details with mechanical precision. White, Clara, 48 years, female, mulatto, widow, literate, property owner, no mention of where she came from. No trace of the name Duval or Harlan, just a woman of modest means living on what was described as productive farmland. The official fiction had been completed, signed, stamped, and archived by the same social order that had once enslaved her. Neighbors remembered her differently. Some said she carried herself like a woman used to giving orders, polite but firm. Others described her as unusually well-spoken, with the faintest trace of a French accent. A small white farmhouse built on the ashes of the grand Harlan mansion became known for its tidy gardens and its silence. Visitors rarely saw her outdoors except at church on Sundays, always in a plain black dress and veil. Sitting near the back pews, St. Joseph's Catholic Church listed her as a contributor from 1867 until her death. The parish priest at the time, Father Augustin Lacroix, noted in his letters that she seemed to possess an uncommon dignity and restraint, and that her donations were given quietly, without signature, but always in precise sums. He never questioned the source of her wealth, nor did anyone else. In a world still recovering from war and ruin, no one wanted to disturb whatever order remained. Those who worked for her spoke of her kindness, but also her distance. She provided small loans to freedmen seeking to start their own farms, gifted livestock to struggling families, and treated the sick with herbal medicines she prepared herself. To the newly freed, she was Madame White, a woman of mysterious origins who had somehow survived both slavery and war to emerge independent. To white townsfolk she was tolerated, an anomaly who fit nowhere but offended no one. In 1875, a photographer traveling through the parish took a daguerreotype portrait of a woman identified only as Mrs. C. White of St. Martin Parish. The image, later discovered in a trunk belonging to the descendants of the Beaumont family, shows an elderly woman of African descent seated on a porch, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her gaze is calm, unflinching, almost regal. On the back of the photo, written in fading ink, are the words, "She lived as they did, and they let her." For decades, the photograph circulated privately among local families, passed down as a curiosity, the woman who lived like a lady. Only much later did historians realize its connection to the Harlan case. Clara White died on September 12, 1882. The parish death record lists the cause simply as old. Age, her modest estate, 2 acres of farmland, a small house, and a few $100s in savings, was divided among 3 local families, all descendants of formerly enslaved workers from neighboring plantations. Her will, unusually detailed, made no mention of her past, only a final request that she be buried on the land she had worked and tended for 40 years. Her grave lay in a small cemetery on the edge of the former Harlan property. A simple headstone read, "Clara White, 1833–1882. At rest for nearly 80 years, the grave remained undisturbed. Then, in 1959, when the cemetery was relocated to make way for new highway construction, her remains, along with others, were transferred to Highland Cemetery in Baton Rouge. The parish report from that year lists her among the relocated, but her headstone was lost or damaged beyond recovery. Her final resting place remains unmarked. In the decades that followed, the Harlan affair drifted into the margins of Louisiana folklore, half legend, half taboo. Teachers didn't mention it, churches avoided it, even local historians treated it as myth. Yet every few years, someone would stumble upon a scrap of evidence, a letter, a diary entry, a rumor, and the story would stir again like dust unsettled by a passing wind. The most ambitious attempt to revive the case came from Dr. Eleanor Pritchard, a historian at Tulane University who began her research in the early 1960s. Fascinated by the fragmentary records, she sought to compile the first comprehensive study of what she called the most disturbing act of collective blindness in Southern history. Her manuscript, titled The Harlan Plantation Mystery, Race, Power, and the Illusion of Order, was submitted to 14 publishers between 1963 and 1966. All rejected it. One editor's response, preserved among Pritchard's papers, read simply, "This is not a story the South wishes to remember." When she sought access to additional records from the St. Martin Parish Historical Society, the Society's director wrote back curtly, "No such family is recorded in our archives." Yet Pritchard had already seen the land deeds. The bank records, the census data, all bearing the same coordinates, the same property lines, the same invisible fingerprints of the vanished Harlans and the woman who replaced them. Disheartened but undeterred, she continued privately, convinced that the suppression was deliberate. In a 1965 letter to a colleague at Tulane, she wrote, "There remains in certain circles a determination to suppress this history, not from guilt, but from fear. The Harlan case exposes a truth more threatening than the brutality of slavery itself, the ease with which an entire society can choose to not see." That line became her legacy. Her manuscript, unpublished but circulated among academics, began to influence a new generation of historians. It was cited in the 1970s during early studies of cognitive dissonance and collective trauma. Psychologists and sociologists used the Harlan affair as a chilling example of systemic denial, a communal act of blindness sustained not by coercion, but by comfort. To this day, no monument stands where the Harlan plantation once lay. Interstate signs and convenience stores cover the ground where 5 bodies were buried in the mud. Travelers cross it daily, unaware that beneath the pavement lies the site of one of the most extraordinary and unsettling mysteries in American history. The story, it seemed, refused to die. Even as local historians dismissed it as folklore, every rediscovered fragment, the photograph, the bank ledgers, the oral testimonies, breathed life back into the past. And with each discovery, the same question emerged anew. How could an entire community not only allow this to happen, but choose to live inside the lie it created? The answer, perhaps, lay not in the documents, but in the human heart, a heart capable of great cruelty and even greater denial. In 1968, a final and perhaps most revealing fragment of the Harlan mystery surfaced unexpectedly. During the renovation of an old townhouse in New Orleans' Garden District, workers discovered a bundle of sealed letters hidden behind a brick hearth. The letters dated from 1848 to 1851 and belonged to Caroline Beaumont, the younger sister of Margaret Harlan. Caroline's husband, a diplomat serving in France at the time, had saved the correspondence after her death. The collection was later acquired by a private historian and only opened decades later. The letters, yellowed and fragile, offered a chilling window into how the mystery looked from within the Harlan family itself. The earliest letter, written in September 1848, just weeks after the family's disappearance, read, "I have received no word from my sister Margaret since my letter of July. I have written twice more and dispatched a messenger to their plantation, but was informed that the family is traveling. It seems most unlike my sister, who detested long absences from home. Something troubles me greatly." By November, Caroline's tone had shifted from concern to unease. I attempted to call at the estate myself, but was received by her maid, Clara. She insisted that the family remained away on business. Yet there was something in her manner that chilled me. She spoke in Margaret's phrases, even used her expressions, as if she were imitating her. When I pressed for their return, she smiled strangely and said, "They are never coming back, but we need not speak of that." I confess the words haunt me still. These lines, preserved in Caroline's neat handwriting, stand as perhaps the most direct contemporary description of Clara Duval after the murders. Her ability to mimic her mistress's tone and speech was so uncanny that it unsettled even those who knew Margaret best. By January 1849, Caroline had begun corresponding with Judge Everett Langston, who by then was already attempting to investigate the disappearance quietly. Her third letter mentioned, "Judge Langston agrees that something is deeply wrong. We have both sought to bring attention to the matter, but each effort is met with resistance. Officials refuse inquiry, neighbors turn away. It is as though an invisible hand has closed every door." She described visiting the Beaumonts, another prominent family in the parish, to seek answers. "Mrs. Beaumont told me she and her husband had dined with my sister just the week before. When I insisted this was impossible, she grew cold and suggested perhaps I was unwell. I left their home shaken. I begin to fear not only for my family but for my own reason. Has the whole parish gone mad?" In her March 1849 letter, Caroline wrote despairingly of her isolation. "No one will speak to me now. Even Judge Langston warns that I should let the matter rest. They whisper that I am hysterical, that grief has unbalanced me. Perhaps they are right, but I know my sister, and I know she would not leave without word. There is a sickness over this place, something that rots not the body but the mind." After that, the correspondence ceases abruptly. Parish records show that Caroline Beaumont sailed for France later that year to join her husband. She never returned to Louisiana. Among the 24 additional letters found in the same cache, she never mentioned her sister again. It was as if she had willed herself to forget, excising the entire event from memory, a pattern of erasure that mirrored what the rest of Louisiana had already done. Historians, who examined the letters after their discovery, called them the smoking gun of the Harlan mystery. They proved that at least one person had tried to confront the impossible truth, only to be swallowed by the same silence that enveloped the entire parish. Dr. Eleanor Pritchard, then retired, called the discovery the missing voice of conscience. In her later writings, she observed, Caroline's descent into doubt mirrors the larger delusion of her community. When reality became unbearable, Both individuals and society chose madness over truth. Her words struck a deep chord with historians, psychologists, and social theorists alike. The Harlan affair, once viewed merely as a grotesque crime, began to be studied as a case of collective denial, a communal decision to uphold the structure of race, power, and hierarchy even in the face of undeniable contradiction. The letters also revealed one more startling detail. Among Caroline's papers was a note, apparently never sent, addressed to her husband. "I no longer know if my sister lives or if she is gone. Yet every time I close my eyes, I see her face upon another's body, speaking in her voice, smiling with her lips. The people here call that woman Mrs. Harlan, and what frightens me most is not that she claims to be, but that everyone believes her." That final, unsent letter was dated March 28, 1849. The same month Judge Langston was dismissed from his position and forced to leave. St. Martin Parish. It remains unclear how many people within the local elite were truly deceived, and how many simply chose to be. Dr. Catherine Monroe's later study concluded that what occurred was a communal performance of sanity. When confronted with an impossible reality, Monroe wrote, "The human mind will invent a version of truth that allows life to go on." In St. Martin Parish, that meant pretending Clara Duval was Mrs. Harlan, because the alternative, that a black woman had annihilated a white family and assumed their identity, was too catastrophic to imagine. The phenomenon went beyond fear of scandal. It became, as one scholar described it, a social contract built on denial. Merchants accepted her payments. The bank honored her signature, clergy blessed her donations, and neighbors dined at her table. Everyone, knowingly or not, participated in maintaining the illusion. A few fragments suggest that even among the black workers on the plantation, the silence had moral weight. In an 1871 interview with a freedman named Jonas Miller, published briefly in a local paper, he said, "We all knew what she'd done, but she gave us something none of the rest ever did, peace. Maybe she killed them, but after that, there weren't no whippings, no shouting. Just quiet. Maybe that's why we helped her keep the lie. She gave us a world where the masters didn't come back." That line, "She gave us a world where the masters didn't come back," would later appear inscribed on the first page of Pritchard's unpublished manuscript as a summary of the affair's moral paradox. By the close of the 19th century, all official traces of the Harlans had been expunged. Maps labeled the former plantation simply as White Farm. Business directories listed C. White & Co. were among small agricultural holdings. In less than 20 years, an entire family's existence had been overwritten by the life of the woman who had ended it. Through the fog of that century-long silence, what emerges is not merely a tale of murder, but a mirror held up to the human condition, a reminder that the boundaries of morality and identity can blur completely when truth becomes too dangerous to face. The historian who catalogued the Beaumont letters concluded, a report with a simple observation that echoed Judge Langston's own words a century earlier. The Harlan case is not just about one woman's deception. It is about the desperate need of an entire society to believe in its own illusion, no matter the cost. Today, almost nothing remains of the land once known as the Harlan Plantation. Modern highways cut through what was once a maze of fields and cypress groves. Convenience stores, motels, and gas stations now stand where cotton once grew, and where 5 bodies were buried under the weight of collective denial. Thousands of cars pass daily over the ground where the Harlans lived and died, unaware that beneath the asphalt lies one of the strangest and most unsettling chapters in Louisiana's buried history. Yet the story refuses to die. Like a submerged root system, it keeps sending shoots back to the surface, each rediscovery, each document, each whispered recollection giving it new life. In 1974, a graduate student named Howard Franklin stumbled upon an unmarked file in the Louisiana State Archives labeled Private Correspondence, Langston Collection. Inside were carbon copies of Judge Everett Langston's final journal entries from 1852, transcribed by his grandson before the originals were lost in a house fire. Among them, one line stood out, written 3 months before Langston's death. "What frightens me most is not that such things can happen, but that we can look directly at them and see nothing at all." Those words later appeared in a 1980 academic paper titled The Anatomy of Silence, Power and Perception in Antebellum, Louisiana. The author, Dr. Marcus Freeman's successor at Tulane, argued that the Harlan case represented not simply a crime or a cover-up, but a perfect microcosm of societal denial, the conscious, willful blindness required to sustain oppression. The discovery of Langston's words reignited interest in the affair. Documentaries were proposed but never produced. Local newspapers published cautious retrospectives, careful not to offend readers who still carried pride in their antebellum ancestry. Even into the 1990s, when civil rights historians revisited the story, the reaction was the same uneasy mixture of fascination and discomfort. The people of St. Martin Parish did not deny the legend, but they rarely spoke it aloud. A few elderly residents, interviewed in the early 2000s, recalled hearing fragments of the tale from their grandparents. One, a retired teacher named Eleanor Guidry, described visiting the area as a child. There was an old oak grove, right by where the interstate runs now. My grandmother used to say, "That's where the lady in the fine dress talked like a white woman." She said the neighbors never spoke her name. They said she made the world turn upside down for a little while. In many ways, that was exactly what Clara Duval, later known as Clara White, had done. She had inverted the rigid hierarchy of her time, not through rebellion or open defiance, but by stepping directly into the role society said she could never occupy. She did not disguise herself in secret. She simply behaved as though the boundary did not exist. And those around her, paralyzed by the impossibility of it, accepted the illusion rather than confront the truth. Dr. Catherine Monroe once called it a social hallucination. In her 1977 lecture at Tulane, she summarized it this way: "When the collective imagination of a society cannot reconcile what it sees with what it believes, it will rewrite reality to protect itself." The Harlan case is not about deception. It is about fragility, about how thin the veil of order truly is. The decades following Monroe's analysis brought only further confirmation. Archival photographs authenticated by historians in the 1980s matched known descriptions of the Harlan dining room. Chemical analysis of the daguerreotype confirmed the date to early 1849. The woman seated at the head of the table wore a gown identical to one listed in Margaret Harlan's household inventory. The face, however, was unmistakably not hers. By the turn of the 21st century, digital archives had made the case accessible to a wider audience. Students and amateur historians began piecing together timelines, cross-referencing ledgers, court records, and oral histories. The composite that emerged was hauntingly complete. August 1st, 1848, Clara Duval poisoned the Harlan family at dinner. August 23rd, merchant Henry Dobson discovered the abandoned carriage. September, local investigation began, then stalled. February 1849, the dinner photograph was taken, confirming the illusion. 1866, the estate legally transferred to Mrs. Clara White. 1882, she died, quietly, unpunished, every detail aligned. What remained impossible to explain was the collective response, the quiet compliance of a town that had chosen fiction over truth. In her final, unpublished essay, Dr. Pritchard offered what many consider the most profound interpretation of the affair. Clara's story is not merely one of vengeance. It is a mirror. It reveals the psychological machinery that allows injustice to persist, the human capacity to agree, upon lies so comforting they eclipse the truth. Entirely, the mystery's endurance lies not in the violence of one night, but in the silence that followed. That silence became its own kind of violence, a slow suffocation of truth through denial and erasure. The parish records, the missing gravestones, the altered maps, all testified not just to forgetfulness but to intention. And yet, through all that suppression, fragments survived. Each rediscovery chipped away at the illusion, forcing new generations to confront what earlier ones could not. In 2010, an archaeological survey conducted ahead of a highway expansion near Bayou Teche unearthed remnants of wooden foundations and charred masonry, consistent with an 1850s plantation rebuild. Among the debris, Researchers found pieces of porcelain marked with the initials M.H., almost certainly belonging to Margaret Harlan. The findings reignited interest once more, drawing journalists, historians, and true crime enthusiasts alike. But within the parish, few wanted the attention. Local officials declined interviews. Church records remained sealed. The silence endured. The ground where the Harlan house once stood has since been leveled and developed into suburban lots. Driveways now trace the same paths where carriages once rolled toward a mansion lit by oil lamps. Families walk dogs and children play above the earth that holds the remains of an unacknowledged past. If you drive along Interstate 10, just east of St. Martinville, you cross directly over that buried history. There are no signs, no plaques, no hint of what once transpired. But some nights, when the air hangs thick and the cicadas hum, locals claim the fog rises heavier over that stretch of highway, low, white, and strange, as if the land itself remembers. Whether one believes such stories or not, the facts remain. A family vanished. A woman once enslaved took their place, and an entire community, bound by custom and fear, agreed to the impossible. That is what makes the Harlan mystery endure. Not just the act itself, but the way human beings can twist reality to avoid unbearable truth. The most terrifying monsters, as Judge Langston once wrote, are not the ones that haunt us from the shadows. They are the ones we refuse to see standing in the light. In the end, the question that lingers is not what happened, but how it could happen. How an entire town could dine, trade, and pray beside a lie so vast it became indistinguishable from the truth. How easily humanity can conspire with itself to look away. Perhaps that is why this story still grips us after nearly 2 centuries, because somewhere, beneath the layers of time and denial, we recognize ourselves in it. The silence that buried the Harlans and protected Clara White is the same silence that echoes through history whenever truth threatens comfort. We hear it in the pages that go missing, in the archives marked "No record found," in the polite evasions of those who prefer their pasts untarnished. And maybe, in the end, that is what history truly is, a negotiation between what happened and what we can bear to remember. So when you next cross that stretch of highway under the Louisiana night, remember the Harlan plantation, and the woman who became both victim and perpetrator, oppressor and oppressed. Remember how easily we can agree to see nothing at all, because some stories refuse to stay buried. They rise, again and again, like bodies in shallow graves after heavy rain, whispering not of ghosts but of the living and the truths we choose not to see.